Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Ask an Expert webinar today. My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager here at the Myers-Briggs Company. Today's webinar will run for about a half an hour, and we will spend the first half answering questions that you all have submitted to us before the webinar, and the second half will be spent answering questions that are submitted during the webinar. So with that, please feel free to submit your questions using the questions box at any time during the webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of them, we will be following up. So just keep your eyes out for that. And we are recording the webinar, so we'll be sending out an email with a link to that recording, as well as some of the resources that will be discussed in the webinar in the next few days. So now I'm happy to introduce our expert today, John Hackston. John is our head of thought leadership and has been with the Myers-Briggs Company for almost 24 years and has been using psychometric tests and questionnaires for 35 years. John is one of the leading authorities in the application of personality type, and his role is vital in keeping the MBTI framework relevant to our ever-changing work environments. So I am happy to hand it over to you, John.
Great, thank you very much, Caitlin. And I have to say, it's very gratifying to be called an expert. So hopefully, the answers I'm going to give to your questions will actually live up to that. But without further ado, let's go straight to the first question we had when we canvassed the questions before this webinar. So that first question was, can the MBTI framework be leveraged to help teams value their differences? And if so, any practical tips for remote environments? So the answer to that first question, I think, is very definitely yes. In fact, I think this is something that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is really good at. The MBTI framework looks at how you are different from other people. That choice of, for example, whether you have extroversion or introversion preferences, that lets me, as an introvert, see how I'm different from extroverts. But also, and this is, I think, really crucial, it looks at those differences in positive ways. So people can see that though somebody might be doing things a different way to how they would do it, that's not wrong. They aren't doing it like that just to irritate them, to pee them off. It's just their way of doing it. And I've seen people move from being annoyed by differences in a team, but then through an understanding of the MBTI framework, to seeing that doing things differently might be okay, and moving on from that to actually appreciating those differences and working with and valuing those differences. I can think of one example of a manager with ESTJ preferences who was finding it very difficult working with a colleague with ENFP preferences, but now, having talked and learned about the MBTI together, they're able to collaborate, and they make actually better and more rounded decisions by building off each other and really value each other's input. And there's actually a really nice webinar by my colleague, Dr. Rachel Kumas-Wilkinson, a recent webinar that talks about this in more detail. So do take the time to look at that as well. The follow-on question was, and if so, are there any practical tips for remote environments? I think the answer again is yes, but actually probably too many to list here. But rather than give you a whole list of things just verbally now, there's actually some really good ideas on our website in the virtual team section, and you can see the URL to get at that on the screen below. And another great resource, which we're going to send on to you after this webinar, is the MBTI Playgroup. Some of you may have seen this already. For those who haven't, it's got lots of ideas for MBTI-based exercises and activities that you can do with teams to help team building programs. Crucially for this question, including in there how you can carry each of those exercises out with remote groups, with remote teams as well. I'm going to send you that playbook after this session. Here then is the next question. So I'm new to being certified. When you administer the MBTI assessment, do you have to debrief the results with each person individually? Or can you do a group session if you obtain everybody's consent? I believe there was a self-debrief as well, but I tend to use that as a last resort. Well, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily dismiss that self-debrief. That's what's called MBTI complete, and that can actually be really useful when time is short and budgets are tight, especially when you're dealing with a big team. It means that if you're running a team build, for example, people can come to that event already knowing or having a very good idea of their type. So that the time this team men spend together can be used for activities that directly address the issues faced by the team. Like, for example, using the Z model to help the team solve problems in a more holistic way and ensure that all the voices of the team are heard when it comes to solving problems. And you can see some of these exercises in the playbook that I mentioned earlier. But let's answer your question directly. Yes, you can indeed do a group session. And in fact, you'll have been through a group session, a group feedback session, as part of the first day of your MBTI certification program. So what you did on that first day is very much what you can do in a group session, and you should be able to have some slides which will show you how to do that. Now, there are obviously disadvantages to a group session compared with one-to-one session. You obviously can't give people the same one-to-one attention, or debrief the questions you might ask individually, or work through their best fit type of them one-to-one. But there's advantages as well. People can actually see their opposite types in action, and that's really powerful. Much more so, I think, than just talking things through. So it may be that a good pragmatic solution might often be to combine MBTI complete with a group session. If you are going to do a group session, though, I think it's really important to be really well prepared. For example, you might want to arrange your timetable so that you give out reports just before a coffee break so that you can offer one-to-one support at that point, if it's needed, with anyone who still isn't quite sure of their verified type. And if you're doing this remotely, as many of us would be doing at the moment, I think it goes without saying that you should be really familiar with the platform you're using and have tested it out on the session first of all. And again, as you said, when you receive the MBTI playbook, you'll find it's got ideas in there that you can deliver the exercises in there in a virtual way. Okay, here's quite a big question. How are diversity, equity, and inclusion taken into account with the MBTI assessment results? If a student or client asks, I want to make sure that I can confidently answer their questions related to DEI. And that's a really interesting question for me, partly because there's lots of different ways in which I could answer it, and partly because I've just completed a short research project into organizational inclusion, which we'll be putting results out before long. But let's look at that question and start with that first part of the question with the MBTI assessment, the MBTI questionnaire. Now, over the years, our research team have done a whole bunch of work to ensure that the assessment is as fair and as objective as possible. The latest versions of the MBTI, for example, was developed using a good large sample of people across the world, not just in the USA. And if we do look at the USA for the latest version and the previous version, a huge amount of work was done to check that that sample was representative of a wider American population. Sometimes you might hear people suggest that you just shouldn't use the MBTI at all, because apparently it's all based on white college students. That really wasn't true in the 1960s when the first version of the question was published, and it certainly is not true now. My colleague, Rich Thompson, who heads up our research team, has produced a couple of web videos on this, and we're going to send those on to you in our follow-up. What about the results of the questionnaire, though? Well, I think that far from being an issue about diversity, equity, inclusion, the MBTI can actually be a force for diversity, for equity, and especially for inclusion. By understanding those differences in personality between ourselves and other people, by learning to value that sort of diversity, I think that puts people in a good place to understand and value other forms of diversity too, and gives them the language and the tools to be inclusive. In fact, we put out a webinar on that very topic, which is available for you to watch. The next question was about sensing and intuition. And I think that this is quite an important question because sensing and intuition are really at the very heart of the MBTI framework. One of the concepts very central to Carl Jung's theory of psychological type. Let's go back to the core of this, and what sensing and intuition are all about. Sensing and intuition are about our favorite process in terms of the way we prefer to take in information, what sort of information we trust. People with a preference for sensing prefer information which is real, which is actual, which is solid, which is based on the evidence of their 5 senses. That's why the word sensing is used for that preference. Whereas people with a preference for intuition prefer and trust information which is about how things combine together, what the possibilities are, where things are heading, what is the big picture. So when we look at the sort of characteristics we might see in people with a sensing preference or intuitive preference, the reason we've put this picture of a camera here is this idea that people with a sensing preference want to zoom in and look at what's really there, the actuality of things, perhaps the detail of what's there, the specifics, the facts, as you can see in our list of characteristics. Whereas people with an intuition preference want to zoom out and see the big picture, look at what's new and see how things combine together. So people with a sensing preference tend to take a realistic approach to problems. They look at what's real and what's actual and want to apply that, whereas people with an intuitive preference want to take that more imaginative approach. Tends to mean that people with a sensing preference are more focused on what's happening now, and perhaps also what past experience tells them, whereas people with intuitive preference get a little bit bored of that and look more to the future, what could be and where things are going. People with a sensing preference want to make sure things work in practice. Does this thing actually work? Does it give me the results I want it to? Whereas people with the intuition preference, it's about, do things work in theory? And not just in scientific theory, but is there a big picture behind this thing? Does it all fit in with my idea of the world? They use conceptual frameworks where people with a sensing preference collect observations and try to see how that relates to reality. And the question, I think, also asked how you might bring this to life for people, how you might people understand it. And I think this is an exercise that you may already see, but I think it's useful. You might want to, if you have a group, separate people into groups of people with a sensing preference or intuition preference, or perhaps ST, SF, NT, and NF. And what you might then do is ask them to look at a picture. So just put that prompt in there. First of all, say, I'm going to show you a picture. Just want you to look at that for a few moments. Don't take any notes or anything. Just look at the picture. And then show them that picture, perhaps for about 15 seconds. And once the timer is up, I'll take that picture away. And if I'm doing this on a virtual basis, I might say, now please write about the picture. I give people a few minutes to do that. And then ask everybody in turn, or a few people, to say, tell me what you've written. Or if I've separated out people into physical groups, sensing and intuition perhaps, I might say, okay, I'm going to have you 10 minutes in your group to talk about that picture, and at the end of about 10 minutes, I want you to tell me and the other group all about that picture. And you will get quite different responses, typically from people with a sensing and intuitive preference, especially if they're in a group, because those differences tend to add together. So with people with a sensing preference, they'll tend to describe what's actually there. You might see them, I'm just going to go back to show you the picture, you might see them actually talk about what's there, talk about the sign that says Valido, and the fact that the Coca-Cola sign at the bottom left is black, but the others are red, and it's back to front for some reason. The guy is wearing a red top, and he's got a yellow cycler helmet on, and he's just off center of the picture, and he's cycling, and it's raining, and it looks a bit wet, and so on and so forth. And you may even see them sort of pointing in the air where different things are as they're describing the picture. They'll describe what's there typically. Whereas people with an intuitive preference will typically talk about the bigger picture, perhaps what the picture means. We may say for this one, whereas obviously it's a wet afternoon and it looks like it's in England somewhere, because I can see a Union Jack. And I remember it's wet quite often in the UK, isn't it? It's probably wet at the moment, even though it's summer. Actually, it's sunny outside at the moment. I'm sitting in the UK, and so on and so forth. So it's the connections between things rather necessarily what's actually there. When you ask people to write about the picture or tell about the picture. And you can even get slightly different responses from people with ST, SF, NT, and NF responses. ST tends to be what's actually there. SF, what's actually there, but looking at and concentrating on the people in the picture, perhaps a little bit of how it makes them feel. NT, the big picture, what this means. NF, the big picture, what it means perhaps for people as well. And if you really want to bring this to life to people, you can then ask them individually in a group to do the opposite. Show them another picture and say, now do it in your opposite preference, just to give people a feel for what it's like. And that was quite different to actually go into another preference. That's what I'll use very often. You can use that with individuals as well. You can also do other things. You can pick up just an interesting object, perhaps an apple, and say, tell me about this or write about this. You'll see the same sort of differences coming out. Or you can, and if you want to do this, you can do this now. Get people to close their eyes and then say, tell me about the room you're in. Only really works if you have a group together, really, this, because people need to be in the same room. And then, with their eyes closed, tell me about the room, and you get the same differences coming out. Or you might get people to, you can do this now if you want to, look at their hand. Just really concentrate, put your hand in front of your face, and really concentrate on the detail that's in their hand there. Look at all the lines in your hand, the slightly different colours, the textures. Really concentrate on that. This is a bit like sensing. We're looking at what's actually there. But one thing to say is that when I'm looking at that, when I'm looking at my hand, everything around me, the big picture is blurred. Because if I focus my attention on the bigger picture, the room around me, I can't see that hand in detail anymore. Everybody can do sensing and intuition, but not both at the same time. And there may also be people with a sensing and intuitive preference who you know. You can use those as anecdotes. So, for example, my partner very definitely has an intuitive preference. Her brother very definitely has a sensing preference. And it's interesting watching them asking directions to each other because they are coming from very different places when they do that. Okay, next question. Can you share suggestions on short activities that can be done to spark interest on potential clients to understand the benefit they receive from the assessment? Share engaging tips which can be used in team building and leadership sessions. Now, I think there's actually at least 2 questions here, probably more. And one of those questions is about helping potential clients to understand the benefits they can get from the MBTI. The others are about engaging short activities and tips. And I'm going to cheat with my answer to that first question, the benefits question. And I'm going to say, come along to the webinar that I'll be running for the Myers-Briggs company on July the 15th. And in that webinar, it'll be around about an hour, I'll be going into a lot more detail on that. I'll be showing how you can demonstrate the impact of the MBTI assessment, how you can show that it does bring benefits with a lot of case studies and examples, but also why sometimes there could be a mismatch between the sort of evidence that perhaps you want to use, that you find most comfortable, and the sort of evidence that might actually convince your clients. In terms of short activities and quick engaging tips, that's actually a really difficult question because there's so many different possibilities. And in this short session, there's really some time to go for them or do them justice. For tips in team building sessions, I'm going to direct you to Playbook again because there really is a great deal of useful content in there. And to spark interest in potential clients, well, when I saw this question, I thought of a Finnish researcher called, and if you're Finnish, please excuse my pronunciation, Pia Hautomaki. And Pia Hautomaki found there were 3 things that business buyers, people like your clients, expect from a salesperson, expect from someone like you in that context. The first 2, they expect them to be confident with their own skills and abilities. And the second, they expect them to take responsibility for that conversation. But the third thing they expect to see their own personality type in a sales meeting. And Hatamaki found that that was the most important thing. And especially when you're looking for a long-term relationship with a client, the most important thing is that the conversation, relationship fits what they need and expect given their personality type. And if you'd like some guidance on how to go about that in terms of thinking about what their personality type might be, or how you might adapt to that, what I can suggest is that you go to our website and type influencing into the search box of the website, and you see lots of great resources, and most of those absolutely free. Okay, I think this is our last question before we throw it open. What's the difference between reported type and verified type? Well, the easy answer is that reported type is what the question results say, and verified type is the type that you ultimately define, or your client ultimately decides fits the best. But let's unpick that a little bit. For me, although we talk about the MBTI assessment, the MBTI isn't an assessment, it's a whole process. It's a process where people can decide for themselves what type fits them best, their best fit type, or as it's often called, their verified type. And that process gets people to think about who they are, which makes it really powerful for development applications. And that process is a little bit like a funnel. The person takes their reported type or MBTI results, and the information that they got from their feedback session with an MBTI practitioner, or from the interactive learning session, an MBTI Complete or MBTI Align, and then uses both of those to decide on their verified type. And that means, of course, that reported type and verified type aren't always the same 4 letters, and for about 3/4 of people, they are, but occasionally reported type are 1, 2, or even 3 or 4 letters different. And actually, that's okay. So long as your client has had the chance to explore who they really are, their verified type, because that verified type is the core of what the MBTI is all about, and even more importantly, that they're able to take that information and then apply it to whatever development purpose they had for using the MBTI, for taking the MBTI assessment in the first place. So that, I think, is the end of the pre-arranged questions that we had. So thanks very much for listening to my answers there. But I'm going to turn you over now to Caitlin, who's going to look at some of the questions that you come up with as I've been talking. Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you. We have had a couple of questions come in, so if you have any other ones, make sure you get those submitted right now and we can go through them. The first one, though, I'm going to ask you is there any data I can share with my senior leadership team on the reliability and validity of the MBTI?
Absolutely, there is. The best place, the easiest place I think to find this is, well, if you're MBTI qualified, you'll always also have a nice big chunky manual, and there's lots of data in there, but that's quite chunky. I just slamming down a big manual on someone's desk may not be the most persuasive way of going around this. A really good source of this is a page on our website called MBTI Facts. And unfortunately, like many things on our website, it's not always the easiest to find. But if you scroll down to the very bottom of the front page of the website, you'll see a sort of dark grey band with various things on there. And MBTI Facts, I think, is one of the headings on there. Just click on that. You can find lots of information about the MBTI, including lots of relatively shorthand information demonstrating the reliability and validity of the MBTI assessment. So thanks, Caitlin. That was a nice, straightforward question.
Great. Okay, here's another one from Suzanne. How do you answer the challenge, aren't you putting people in boxes, even though we say we are not?
Okay. So clearly the MBTI is a way of categorizing people, and that's the way it's seen by people. But that's not the case. It's a way of people deciding what type fits them best. It's not about us as, quote, experts, unquote, getting a big rubber stamp and stamping 4 letters on someone's head and saying, there you are, that's your box, live in it. It's a person deciding for themselves what type fits them best. That's the first part of the way I would answer that question. I'd also go on to say is that One of the tenets of the MBTI is that you can act against type. And many of you will have seen that handwriting exercise as a way for people to find out, to bring the idea of preference to life. And for anyone who hasn't come across before, the idea is that you get people to sign their name with the hand they normally do, and then you say, lay down that pen or pencil, pick it up with your hand and sign your name again. Now, what was it like when you did it the first time with your preferred hand? What was it like when you did with the second time with your unpreferred hand? And people say, well, the first time it was easy, it was straightforward, it was automatic, I didn't have to think about it. The second time it was slower, I had to think about it, the result wasn't really like my signature, etc. But the point of that exercise is you can do it. Even though you have a preference for one side or the other, one hand or the other, you can use the hand when you need to. And in exactly the same way, your type does not define you. You can act against type. You can do things differently when you want to. One metaphor that we sometimes use is think of a type table not as a set of boxes, but as a house with rooms. You may have a favorite room. So my type is for INTP. So I'll spend a lot of time in an INTP room, but I can move to other rooms if I need to do so. So here I am presenting something for half an hour, talking a lot. May not sound like the most obvious thing someone of introversion preference to do, but it's entirely reasonable for me to do it because that's the thing that I'm doing today. So just the same way as you might have a favorite room in your house, maybe your living room, maybe your lounge, but you can visit other rooms from time to time. Maybe you visit the kitchen from time to time because you need to go there. You can do things against type when you need to do it. Type isn't constricting, it's not a box, it's a springboard. If you know where you're coming from, you can go other places more straightforwardly. Hopefully that answers Suzanne's question.
Awesome. So I think we're going to have time for one more of these questions. And like I said, we will follow up directly with the rest of the question askers to answer some of these. So the last one that I'm going to ask you, John, is from Tina, and it is, what handy questions can participants leave with that helps build relationships with others after learning about the MBTI?
Really interesting question. Now, what you can't see is I'm now going into my introvert place and burbling desperately while I try to think of an answer to it. Really interesting question. I think it really depends on the event, or I think one of the things that is actually really important in any MBTI feedback session, whether it's group or individual or any session, is that you agree up front with your client what the purpose of that session was in the first place, and then you can relate things back to it. There are some useful tools you can help with those questions to build those relationships. Tools like the Flipper type tip, or tools like the MBTI app, which help you to think about how you might work better with other people. There's also, I think, if I recall rightly, the playbook, some examples of things you could use there as well. I'd struggle to think of a single question, though, because I think it does very much depend on the circumstance. But I think for me, one of the real strengths of the MBTI as a tool is that it's deceptively simple. It starts off by looking at those differences, and you can see how other people are different from who you are, and you can start to look at those differences in those positive ways. But I struggle to think of a standard question or one question that I was always asked, because everybody's different and every experience is different. And I'm sorry if I've wimped out of give you an exact answer to your question, Tina.
Well, I think you've highlighted some of those great resources that can help. And obviously, if anybody has any other questions, you can, continue to submit them so we can look into those. And just to sort of wrap this up, I did want to highlight something that John has been talking about a lot is the playbook. And that email, we've been emailing that out to our practitioners for a while. So if you feel like you haven't received that or you haven't seen any new resources from us, make sure you check in on your current status of your subscription to our emails, because we do send out new resources, updated resources, all kinds of great things pretty regularly. So definitely check on that. Make sure you're subscribed. And we will be sending out all of the links that John talked about today. So those webinars, the playbook, a couple other things to sort of give everything to you in a nice one spot in an email. So thank you all so much for joining us for today, and we will be reviewing the rest of the questions that have come in, and we may be doing another one of these, so if you have any other questions that you'd like us to consider, definitely send them over, and yeah, we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.